Welcome to Democratic Visions. This half hour is about the health of journalism as news deserts spread throughout Minnesota and the country, and as artificial intelligence moves in. We've got two informed experts to compare notes.
If you really do have the credibility and the support of the community.
Michael McEntee pioneered the use of new media to cover Minnesota politics. He created The Uptake, the nonprofit news service, notably live-streamed the 2008 Franken-Coleman U.S. Senate vote recount. Mike was also a top manager at the All News Channel and was Egan TV's executive director and hosted a live talk show on AM 950 radio. Mark Neusel chairs the Department of Emerging Media at St. Thomas University.
Give credit to the community leaders to come together.
During its formative year, Mark Neusel gave Eden Prairie local news an enthusiastic thumbs up. He's been a wire service and newspaper reporter and spent 4 years at the Star Tribune as a copy editor. Mark is also an author and a popular speaker nationally on environmental issues and canoeing.
Off we go.
Okay. Well, we were throwing a couple topics here, and let's dig into them. We want to talk about just emerging media and where things are, and how does it survive, and all those kind of good things. You want to offer your thoughts first, and I can follow up?
Well, I think we're in a time of tremendous transition. That's not really news to anybody. But what we need to be thinking about is what happens after this time of transition sort of settles down and we figure out A, B, C, and D that are going to come out of it. I don't think we know all those answers yet. I think we know it's going to be a combination of things that we have to be ready for. We have to still train journalists. We have to provide people with news so that democracy functions, and we have to provide it in a multimedia way. And then beyond that, it's like, what do we do? How do we pay for it? How do we distribute it? How is it consumed? All those questions are in the process of being answered, but I don't know if we have any definitive answers yet today.
What you're telling me is that basically everything's up in the air.
It is up to the point that, you could say, okay, people will consume news on their phone, but we're not sure about how they're funded. Somebody's got to pay for it, for example.
Yeah. So I've been laboring in the trenches in independent media here.
The vineyards.
The vineyards. And my hands are calloused with it, with the news. Not the News Inc. anymore, though, for the last decade plus. And I can tell you that A, it doesn't pay, and B, the big guys always win. And if you come up with an idea, you can be absolutely sure that somebody else is going to steal it.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yeah, it is. Because of so many things. We need to come up with a way that that we can find a way of paying the people who actually do the work.
Right.
I mean, right now, the company that makes the most on everybody's work right now is Google and Facebook. And there's been some attempts in Australia to do some laws to say, hey, you got to negotiate for that stuff, but that works out for the big guys, doesn't work out for local independents. And so I think we need a whole spectrum of solutions to fix stuff, but there's some big ones I think we can kick into first.
Well, I think we kind of got ourselves into a box because people were used to getting their news for free, or at least what they thought was free. Of course, they were paying for it. We had an advertising model, we had a subscription model, we had a circulation model. But when the shift, 25 years ago starts to drift towards the web, and then content was given away essentially for free, that was a big mistake. And we've been trying to figure out how to rectify that mistake ever since. Because now people, to a certain degree, they'll subscribe to a daily newspaper and pay for the paywall and so forth. But it gets harder and harder the smaller you get down the food chain of media, right? They'll pay for the New York Times, but maybe not in Bloomington or Eden Prairie or, Little Falls, for example. So we need to figure that out. And once we get that figured out, if we can, I think things will be better.
I think one of the problems with journalism is that, yes, you do have to pay for it, and yet all those models you talked about, do exist. The problem is that things are let to go to the extreme. I will bring up Fox News just for the moment right now. Recently we found out that this whole thing with Fox was trying to get an audience's attention, and they were worried about losing it to other organizations like Newsmax, and so they willingly lied to their audience to keep that audience because they needed the money, you know. And that shows when you don't have the ethics in the way of what happens in the business of journalism. And so we need to have both ethics, and I'll argue maybe not the business side of things. I think we need a way of funding journalism that isn't always reliant on, gee, did you get a big audience?
Yeah.
You know, and are you appealing to the people who are going to spend on the products I'm trying to sell?
Right. I would agree with that. What you're saying is essentially that with rights come responsibilities.
Yeah, Spider-Man.
I don't know if I'd put it that way, but that's not a bad thought. You know, so we've got the democratic process in place with the First Amendment and free speech and free press and so forth. But with those rights come responsibilities, and responsibilities are another way to say ethics. It's the same thing. And so they should work in tandem, and it should then allow for a trust in the audience and the employees who are producing the content as well, I might add. But I would also argue, I'd add one more step to your argument, that the audience has a responsibility too. And it's an ethical responsibility. And if the content that they're seeing is unethical in some way, if they're being lied to, they need to turn the channel. They have an ethical responsibility not to watch, not to participate if shenanigans are going on.
Yeah.
And what we're not really getting that very much.
I mean, part of the problem is, and I'll go back to the Fox example, part of the problem with Fox in that particular case is they are playing into what the audience wanted. And we like to be told things that we want to believe. You know, we want that confirmation bias, as it's called. And you know, that's what's been happening. As we used to just watch, you know, back when I was a kid, there were 3 networks, and you watched Walter Cronkite or somebody, and that's where you got your news from. Now we have anybody with a phone on Facebook is a source. Now, if you find the person that you like, their opinion the best, or the way they're presenting the best, you're going to pay attention to that person. I agree with you, but I think where the responsibility starts is in the education system to start teaching people about media literacy and to understand when you might be lied to and how you need to be looking for additional sources on stuff.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about being a critical media consumer, and we have a media literacy course. And if I was king of the world, or at least president of the University of St. Thomas, I would say every student needs to take that class. It is true. And if you're not trained to watch out for it, how are you going to know? I mean, it's not something instinctively, I mean, perhaps some people can instinctively tell when they're being lied to, but not everybody can. And with the confirmation bias, preaching to the choir, they're not going to challenge it anyway, because it just makes them feel better about who they are as a person, or what culture they're from, or what social system they're existing in. And so to train them to think about, what are they actually telling me? What kind of sourcing are they using? Is it verifiable? You know, all the questions that we bring forth is, you're not born with it. You got to learn it. And somebody's got to teach it to you. And that's what we need to do.
I want to talk about the other leg in this stool, which is the funding. Because I think what's driving some of the things we're seeing here is always trying to get the most money in the door and ignoring the audiences that don't generate a lot of revenue. And I think when you look at local news, a lot of really hyper-local news doesn't generate a lot of revenue unless you're aggregating it, and at that point you're ignoring kind of the real news. Yeah, local.
Yeah.
So, you know, how do you do that? And I had a couple thoughts I wanted to toss out on that. I, for a time, worked in community media, and community media is funded by a lot of it by cable fees. Okay, so if you're watching us right now on a cable, this is done at an access cable station, you know, money comes in from the people who subscribe to cable that helps pay for this. Okay, it's a fee, you could call it a tax, whatever it is. A lot of that money is going away because over time, the cable companies have said, we're not doing cable, we're not doing television, we're doing internet, and that's a different product, and you can't tax us or can't pay a fee on that. So the money for this keeps going down. We need to, say, okay, we're going to change that definition, so this is where the money's coming from. But we also need to say, we're going to take that money and we're going to use it to do local news, not pay for the city's police department, or because cities can do whatever they want to with this money. You know, I've worked for city government. I know where the money can end up going. But put some guardrails on it. Say, we're going to focus it on doing news, and we're also going to have a nonprofit from the outside come in and do this, as opposed to, because the city should not be doing its own news. That's propaganda. But if we did something like that and came up with, you know, a way of reinvigorating the access centers and the community media that we have, and realizing it's more than just television, and it's more than just in the urban areas. Let's do this in the exurban and the rural areas where there is a real news desert.
Right.
Let's start bringing in nonprofit groups to do that, and start having them create the news. You know, yeah, there's going to be a lot of issues with that too, but I think that's a big step up over, I'm going to get my local news from Facebook.
Do you, what do you think of the idea that the BBC uses for funding of taxing equipment? You know, every TV set sold, every radio station, radio sold.
That's been going on for a long time.
Correct.
I mean, since they created the BBC.
Right.
BBC is a real good service. I
It
mean,
is. You think that would work here?
well, I mean, we have the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It's not built on that, you know,
Right.
but it's the same idea. It's a big national model that does something. And I think that's part of the solution, but the problem I have with the large, I'll call it corporate public media, is that it tends to exclude, you know, a lot of people. It tends to take dollars. I'll point to Minnesota Public Radio. 2019, they spent like $6 million on their top 12 executives, $5 to $6 million in top 12 executives, one of them making like $740,000 a year. Can't tell me that you need to pay executives that much to run a public radio operation. So, you know, I have a bias against large corporations like that, and I'd like to see it be smaller nonprofits, and that you can't put those together and things like that. But we do need a national media, and we do need a way of funding that. And so I think that, you know, certainly, yes, you could look at a tax or something like that as a way of funding, funding national news. I think that'd be a great idea.
A user tax is not a terrible idea. However it's implemented, I think it's something that needs to be looked at. And if it's sales of equipment, that's one thing. There could be another, you know, cabling or streaming or some other kind of circumstance. And I'm not smart enough to know how to implement something like that. But it all boils down to the question that we started with: is how is it funded? And when you mentioned early on that it's got to be a combination of sources, I think that's clearly going to have to be the answer. There'll be some philanthropy. There'll be maybe a tax, maybe a fee, a rights fee. Maybe still advertising, maybe still circulation / subscriptions of some sort, but it's going to have to be the magic elixir of a combination of all those things.
Because everything's got an Achilles heel. I mean, you talked about foundations. Foundations generally don't want to fund a specific organization for their infrastructure and to do something. They generally want to fund, hey, we'd like you to do stories about X.
Sure.
And you go, well, that's great, but what I really need is to buy a camera or a computer or something like that.
Yeah.
And then you end up doing all these kind of gymnastics to justify that. It would just be easier to say, here's some money, go cover the news.
General fund, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why it's got to be a recipe, because maybe part of the recipe is a foundation that wants more agricultural coverage. And you'll say, okay, we'll do it. But then another income source, maybe the tax, is for buying new equipment. And so you strategize in that way. And then, of course, don't drop anything, don't break it.
Or know how to fix it if you do.
Yeah, or make sure you have a toolkit.
That's right.
Yeah.
Another topic we wanted to talk about was what everybody's been buzzing about, artificial intelligence. And I think I mentioned before we started that I play around on my phone with Chat GPT, sometimes for amusement, sometimes to ask it, if you're going to write a business plan for what I need to do, what would it look like, you know? And I found that, it is, pretty good at giving pretty good generic answers. But people are people who are in the media are wondering, is this is a threat to their jobs?
Yeah, and the answer is yes. If it can generate a sports story from a basketball game where the data is fed into the system in some fashion, the box scores and play-by-play flow into the system, there's no reason why an AI program couldn't spit out, and they're already doing it, it couldn't spit out a game story from a basketball game. So there's no question it'll impact jobs. It's like, there used to be linotype operators too, but they're gone. The issue you've got, of course, is it's pretty glitchy. There's mistakes, and when there's mistakes, there could be really bad mistakes. And then you've got the issue of the legal issue.
Yep.
Who's responsible? Because is it the publisher? Is it the producer is it the AI producer? Is it the publisher of the newspaper if it's a newspaper? Who's legally responsible if there's a libel?
Right now, we allow social media companies to say we don't have responsibility for our content. This would be different. This would be AI being generated for a newspaper, a television station, or whatever, an outlet. And so I think just by that, you're going to have a demand to make this more accurate, or you're going to see that there's more checks and balances. You're going to have, yes, you may not have 5 reporters out covering the basketball games at the various high schools that night, but you're going to have one editor looking at all that stuff before it goes out and gets published.
In a hurry.
In a hurry.
On a short deadline.
On a short deadline.
With a whole bunch of copy coming in.
Right.
None of which you can trust.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want that job.
No, I wouldn't either.
Because if you mess up, and it might not be you messing up, it might be it could be the data input. I mean, data in, data out kind of thing. Somebody puts in the wrong number somewhere, and there's a human element to all of it at some level, someplace. Whether it's just somebody keeping score, if we continue with the sports analogy,
Sure.
Somebody's keeping a scorebook somewhere, and that person could make a mistake. And back in the old days, I covered enough basketball games to know it happens.
Yeah. Here's the thing, though. We're talking about sports. That's not likely somebody's going to sue for libel over that.
No.
It's when we start getting into bigger stories.
Right.
And I think that's where you're going to see the level of people reviewing things is going to have to be there. You're going to have to editors. You're going to, instead of me, lots of reporters, you're going to need lots of editors.
Well, journalism is based on trust. And if AI is considered to be faulty in any way or error-filled in any way, the trust is going to erode.
I think the key with AI is the prompts that you give it. And this gets away from reporting out of live data, but this gets into looking at, okay, I'm going to take the full knowledge of what it's absorbed and try to put together a story. The better journalists can come at putting together questions and feeding initial data into like a ChatGPT, the better answers you will get. And citing sources is the next generation of this thing, and I think that's going to be helpful. But there's another whole group of people in the kind of journalism field, content marketers or people who make content for marketing that are freaking out about this, because so much of a content marketing job is taking stuff and just rehashing it, reissuing it, and I can turn to this thing.
Repurposing, they call it. Yeah,
repurposing. And I can type into this thing, write me 15 tweets about blah, 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 and it will spit out everything I need, plus the hashtags that have to go with it. We have become very formulaic in how we do, social media, and we know what pushes people's buttons, and it's very well documented. And so this can do people's jobs like that. I sat in on a webinar this week where people were, and that was their job, was to be content marketers. A good portion of them were freaking out about this whole thing. I looked at this in my smug journalism hat and said, you know what, if you guys just sourced it yourself instead of just were working on rehashing things, you'd have a more secure job.
You need unique content.
Yes.
Unique content is critical in all these circumstances. It's just like students attempting to plagiarize something, it's up to me or the other instructors to craft an assignment that forces them to create unique content. You can't just say, give me an essay about George Washington's presidency in the last 2 years in office. Well, that's okay. That's not going to be a problem.
No.
But you need to figure out what can I assign, and then what can the student produce. And in this case, it wouldn't be students, of course, but content creators have to come up with some unique ideas and unique content. It'll eventually be rehashed by somebody else, maybe, but at least you've got it the first time.
I think it involves giving people a personal perspective and your own story, and bringing something to it that just doesn't exist elsewhere. So
right, yeah.
And being able to say, let's say that I'm a black woman or I'm a black queer woman. If I were writing, if I were that person, I could bring a perspective to an issue that generally doesn't get expressed.
Right.
Might be of interest, and might be told in an interesting way that a AI program is not going to come up with. It's digging into those things, and eventually, I think AI is going to figure that stuff out too. And you could say, I'm going to, write this if I were a, So that's not a foolproof thing either. There are a lot of different forms of community media. One thing I like to talk about is the community media that's not like a television access, but where people get their information like on the web. And we've got a pretty good example of that now in the Twin Cities.
Right. The Eden Prairie local news operation is a great example of what can happen when community leaders come together after the death of a pretty good local newspaper, run into the ground, so to speak. Give credit to the community leaders to come together and say, hey, we need a local news source, and we need to figure it out. And they were smart enough to figure out it's going to be web-based, and it probably wasn't going to pay a lot of money at the beginning, and it needs to get its feet under it and get running. But so far, so good. And other communities could take a good long look at that and think, you know what, if they can do it, we can do it.
Yeah, I'd like to see more of that. The problem is we end up with so many, I'll call zombie local newspapers that exist. St. Cloud, I think famously, is down to one, or was down to zero now, reporters with their newspaper, and the Fargo Forum is jumping in, the Forum Communications. But so many of the local weeklies have just become run out of one place, and there's one person covering 20 city council meetings, trying to feed all these different newspapers.
Right.
It just doesn't work.
You need more people, and how you get those people and how they're compensated is the question. Right now, there's undoubtedly going to be civic-minded volunteers. There's going to be people who like to use a camera and just want to see their stuff more widely viewed. I mean, it's going to be a combination of staff and volunteers and half-time people and whatever you can get off the ground. But I think once you establish the community trust and the community viewership or readership, and the advertisers start to come, and maybe there's some local foundations that help, and then it's just maybe it's a subscription service. As we've talked about, it's a combination of things. Funding resources.
I think making something like that sustainable is the hardest part of the equation, because it's always this burst of energy to start something, but then how do you really make it work?
Right. You got to transition to the second generation. So just like any other industry, right? Grandpa started a farm, he made a great farm, but then you got to pass it on to the grandson. That's the problem. And it's always the visionaries that have to then pass it on to the folks that have to do the work next. And finding that second generation of people who are as passionate about it as you are, and well organized and maybe as well funded and well connected, is really going to be the key. But they're out there. You just got to find them.
I think what's worked very well with Eden Prairie is that there's been a good board and you've got the right community leaders involved, and that's important because you need to have buy-in.
Right.
Otherwise, you're fighting I've been in city media, in city government, and they look at the media sometimes as an adversary. And if you don't have that community support, they just go, oh, it's so-and-so from such and such writing a blog, and just say something to her, or just ignore her, If you
They were doing that before, too.
Right, but if you can't be ignored, if you really do have the credibility and the support of the community, you need that.
It
To make
opens the
work.
door.
Yeah,
It opens
does.
doors and gets people to return your calls. And that's, as you know, that's half the battle of the business, is talking to people and getting them to respond in a timely fashion, truthfully.
So let's talk about corporate news, because most of the news that we get every day comes to us from some corporation. Somebody someplace is trying to make a lot of money by getting our eyeballs on stuff. And as I've mentioned, I think that's one of the basic flaws that we have that we need to solve, but it's kind of here. So what can we do about it?
Well, I don't think it's a new problem, because we could probably stretch back into the 19th century and see newspaper chains like Pulitzer and Hearst and those guys really producing corporate news in the 1890s. Now we've got many more media sources that still are the same. It's still the same issue, and it was a problem then, it's a problem now. But I'm a little bit encouraged, because we always have sort of these independent operators who can come up, who are producing journalism in some way outside the corporate structure. And every once in a while, you know, one of them catches fire. And it could be a website, it could just be an individual who's really aggressive about marketing his or her content to wherever. Could be YouTube, could be any, you know, Instagram, could be anything. I'm encouraged that despite everything that's happened, we're still a nation of entrepreneurs. And if there's a niche for it, somebody's going to try and fill it. And with corporate news, there's still a niche for the independent operator. They just need to be able to figure out where it is and how to fund it, and everything that everybody's been dealing with since time immemorial.
I think you're right there. The problem becomes very much what we see in the tech industry, which is when somebody comes up with a good idea, somebody else buys it or crushes it.
Yeah.
And a lot of that happens in the media as well. You know, it will be, I will either buy your idea or steal it, or I will somehow use my corporate infrastructure to make sure that you don't succeed. You know, and
That's a cheery view, Mike.
I know. I'm happy to be here, to be such a happy, bright light in our discussion about media.
Well, one of the things that, you know, we could touch on just briefly is many of the laws related to free expression are state by state. Public records, public access, you know, cameras in the courtroom. There's a number of different things. It's past time that those need to be reviewed, and protections need to be put in place for the independent operator. It's too easy for a big corporation to crush the little guy. It probably always will be to a certain degree, but we could do better in terms of legal protections for the independent operator, and we really don't do a very good job of that.
This set the scene for one of Minnesota's highest profile trials.
I had some experience with cameras in the courtroom when the uptake was covering the recount between and the trial between Al Franken and Mr. Coleman. It was a contentious thing that Al Franken won the Senate race eventually by a few hundred votes. Because I had media background, we were able to say we are on equal footing with any other television station, and therefore we have access to this pool, and we will be the pool camera.
Okay. So
we were able to play with the big guys because of the rules that were written for court coverage. And because the rule was you had to be credentialed media, meaning you had to have a Senate credential, which we had worked very hard to get, and in fact got tossed out of a lot of places before we got those credentials. But that's because there was a process in place to say this is legitimate media. Without that door, without that floor, I think people are scared on who might be able to come in and do whatever to cover something, and you end up with.
Both Mark and Mike had more to say, and you'll hear from them in a future Democratic Visions. Right now, have a good time, enjoy the spring, and we'll see you next time.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers from Eden Prairie, Hopkins, Minnetonka, Edina, and Bloomington. Watch us on select cable systems and on our YouTube channel.